So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our moderator for this session, Ms. Diana Kelley. Diana is the founder and CTO of SecurityCurve and also a 30-year industry veteran who does serve on the board of directors of 2 nonprofits, including Women in Cybersecurity, as well as Sightline Security, where she's also the CTO. Diana has a very colorful history of volunteering and leading companies. And without further ado, Diana, I'd like to pass it on to you, and we'll have our esteemed panelists join you as we start this panel of navigating cloud security challenges of today.
Thank you so much, Sandia. According to a report by Risk-Based Security, the number of publicly reported data breaches decreased by 40% in 2022. But the total number of records compromised actually increased by 141% to over 37 billion. That's by far the most records exposed in a single year since RBS began reporting in 2005. So as Sandia said, today we're going to be addressing the question, is the cloud secure, and how can you enable your company to use the cloud more security and protect yourselves and your customers? Joining me today is an elite panel of experts. Kirsten Newcomer, who is the Director of Cloud Security Strategy at Red Hat. Dan Gordon, the Director of Technical Evangelism at Traceable AI. Prakash Tripathi, the Vice President of Engineering at Cisco. And Adrian Ludwig, who is the Chief Information Security Officer for Atlassian. Welcome, everyone.
Good to be here.
Great to be here. Thank you, Diana.
So in the numbers that were quoted above, the mention was that the breaches went down, but the number of exposed records went up. So I just thought we could start off today with a discussion about that. So Kirsten, would you mind kicking us off? Do you have thoughts on that? You know, why are attackers going after more lucrative targets, or are smaller companies no longer a target?
Yeah, I think it probably is that with the move to work from home, and, you know, due to the pandemic, we likely are seeing much more focus on larger companies and bigger data sets at those larger companies, right? Bigger bang for the buck. And again, when everybody was working in the office, much more controlled environment, controlled data center, work from home potentially opened up some new avenues of attack for the larger organizations.
Yeah, absolutely. Dan, what do you think about that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. There's, you know, assuming that small company means small data sets, I think it's, you know, what like Kirsten was saying. You know, there's a famous American bank robber, Willie Sutton, who once said, when he was asked by the press, you know, why do you rob banks? He said, because that's where the money is, right? And I think we're seeing a lot of that, right? I don't know that we're seeing less attacks, but certainly we're seeing bigger attacks, bigger prizes, right? And I think there's 2 things that are coming together that are causing this, at least. One is, as has been happening, bigger companies have become really, really good at collecting lots of data. So there's this big treasure trove of data, and they're ripe for the picking. But the other piece of this is just important, is that with the rapid adoption, because of the pandemic, because of just a general you know, move to cloud native and adoption of microservices, these new architectures, they're API communications between all the pieces, right? And that is a whole new API attack surface that's become much more prevalent. And you know, there's never been better opportunity out there, bigger prizes with this level of security vulnerabilities available, because we've added, you know, more complexity. You know, Gartner predicted that in 2022, API abuse was going to become the most frequent attack vector for data breaches in enterprise web applications. Akamai in 2020 said, yeah, we're 83% of the traffic we're seeing is already API. That was in 2020. So we have bigger collections of data, not well protected. It's good opportunities.
The technology times, they certainly are changing. So Prakash, you know, data records are not the only things that can go missing in the cloud, though, right? I mean, what else should companies be looking at and thinking about as they expand their digital transformation journey?
No, absolutely. I think first I would like to kind of touch upon what Dan talked about a bit, but then certainly I want to get to this question of yours. Clearly, 70 to 80% of the workforce in large enterprises are either, constitute of coming from roaming users or the branch offices, especially with the shift to SaaS and infrastructure as a service, platform as a service. There is clearly an inversion of traffic. 80% of the traffic are bound to internet, direct to internet. As Kirsten pointed out, we are at an inflection point, especially with the future of work arriving overnight, accelerated by the pandemic, right? Attackers are certainly looking for a path of least resistance, and there are clear statistics to prove that 2/3 of the attacks are originating from the branch or the remote users. So clearly there is an aspect of data, but then there is an aspect of network element in it in terms of how these enterprises manage their network. We are in a world where network is getting decentralized, but at the same time, security is not, because there are real limitations in terms of decentralizing security. So imagine if one has to manage the security elements and all the branches of large enterprises. It is an unmanageable task, especially when you have point products scattered all around. Managing and orchestrating all of them is a big bit of challenge. So clearly, protecting data is one thing, but managing these security elements is a higher order step. So certainly centralized cloud-based security implementation is critical to prevent the data theft. But in my view, there is an element of application experience that is important for any corporates, right? At the end of the day, products are experienced through applications. So application experience is going to be super, super important in this context, Diana.
Yeah, very true. Adrian, your thoughts on, in addition to data, what else do we have to think about and protect?
Well, I want to touch on that stat first, actually, because I think it's very tempting to talk about the growth in the size of the records. But it's the other statistic that I think is super interesting, right? In the face of increasing need to do reporting in this, both due to regulatory changes and also just an awareness by companies that being as forthright as possible is actually a good thing, and that's what drives trust. The number of exploitations went down. Like, that's kind of incredible. And I think it's worth celebrating that for a moment, right? That even though companies are now more prone, both because they have to and because they want to release information about breaches, there were fewer. So I think that's a pretty remarkable contrarian view on where we've headed with security. So excited to see that, actually. Yeah, the number of records that was exposed is larger, but all of the companies are probably larger, and there are lots of, sort of growth in those systems to lead to it. So it's super interesting there. I think, both all three of the other panelists pointed to really excellent changes that we're seeing in terms of how it is that the attack surface is becoming more complicated, how we have to think about APIs and network boundaries, et cetera. And ultimately, that's the role of the security team, is to think about how to rationalize that complexity and be able to describe what's going on and actually have some coherence to it. So it's kind of nice to see some stats that seem to support that maybe some of these security teams are actually doing a better job than we thought.
Yeah, a little bit of hope in an area where sometimes it can.
2021 is all about hope, right?
Yeah, that's right. So, Kirsten, not many companies are in only a single cloud, right? You may use Google Workplace or O365 for productivity, but then AWS for your IaaS and a variety of other clouds behind your SaaS solutions. How do you get visibility into all of these different instances where your data and your work is occurring?
Yeah, that is absolutely a reality and a challenge. And we see that not just for SaaS solutions, right? Where when I'm consuming a SaaS offering, I do have the opportunity to work with the vendor to try and figure out how are we going to, hard questions get asked of vendors for SaaS offerings, et cetera. But we see at Red Hat, we see a lot of companies working with Kubernetes and containers across the public clouds as well. And sometimes they're choosing Google for AI services, and AWS is still kind of the prominent, most used player in that space. And so really thinking hard about what are the tools that you can put in place that give you common governance approach and ideally visibility across those clouds becomes key. And certainly there are solutions available in the containers and Kubernetes space. There are numbers of offerings both for cross-cluster management, for cross-cluster security, and kind of getting a dashboard view across all of those. You also want to use appropriate automation, and there it becomes, if you're cross-cluster, is there one set of automation tools that you can use to manage your deployments, and is that worth your time? But at minimum, like observability, visibility, that is the first, the lowest bar, right? And look for solutions that give you the ability to apply policy across those clusters in a consistent way. Okay, maybe the first bar is create those policies, and the second bar is find a tool that helps you implement them.
Good point, right? Right. Decide what you want to do, write it down, policy, and then go do it. Any other thoughts, Dan or Adrian or Prakash, on what do we do about multi-cloud visibility for security?
Yeah,
Adrian,
I think
Kirsten
got at something that's super interesting there that's not obvious. Before cloud, the way you interacted with things was physical, right? And physical things, like the way you got an inventory was a person walked around a room and said, there's a box, ooh, there's one under the desk. But in cloud, the way that you create an inventory is you call an API. The way that you automate is you call the API a bunch of times, as opposed to hiring a bunch of people to walk around and create a bunch of spreadsheets. And so even in a world where you've got multiple different clouds that are being incorporated, the interfaces to be able to do basic understanding and inventory and asset management are actually present. So I think there's a pretty subtle revolution that's going on in terms of security, where we've actually got the ability to have visibility where we just didn't have it before. Now, I wouldn't directly say that's why things are getting better, but it can't be hurting, right? It's certainly aligned with that. And the realization that you don't need more security tools, you need the tools that you have to be better integrated with one another, better integrated with their APIs, better populated with real data that's reliable data. I think that's the real sort of undercurrent of change that's going on in security right now, is we're just getting to a point where we actually know what's going on.
Yeah, you said it well, Adrian. Clearly, there is not lack of tools. There is, we have
like 100. I've heard that's more on the low end. So.
The security teams are inundated with volumes of data, right? And especially from point products. So there are clearly no scalable way of managing and orchestrating this, right? I think Kirsten called out that automation piece. So there is an automation element, there is an orchestration element. So I think that's where the focus needs to be, in my view.
Yeah. And if I could just kind of come back and add a few things, I agree with both of you, right? There are plenty of tools. API-driven automation is key. Managing that complexity of data is also key. And one of the challenges as people move to more ephemeral workloads that move around, you have to contextualize the data in new ways. And that means that some of our existing security tools also have yet to be updated for cloud native solutions, both cloud native applications and infrastructure. And so it's not that those tools aren't out there, but we need to help our security teams think a little bit differently. The policies don't change, but how you implement those policies may in fact change and should change. And then how do we manage the proliferation of data? That's a great point, Prakash, right? There is so much data that we really need to start adding, really contextualizing and smart filters to all of that data to make it more consumable for the security teams.
Yeah, just to give a really concrete example that people, if you haven't run into it already, you will soon. Our classic mechanism for doing scanning of our infrastructure is to gather an inventory, and then send it over to a scanner and have a scan run. Well, it turns out even if there's a 5 to 10 second delay between the inventory gathering and the scanning, the thing we scan may no longer be our thing. And so we were constantly getting back reports of vulnerabilities that were like in a language that we don't even run, Portuguese servers. And we're like, how is this possible? And we eventually realized that we needed to have not an inventory taken, every now and then, but we needed to have a real-time inventory. And we needed to make sure that before and after it was still the object that we were scanning was our own.
Right.
And so that that's just a different view, right?
Yeah. No more IP address as the hook for your inventory.
Yeah, the speed is just amazing. So Dan, connected to that is really this revolution in low code, no code, thanks to the cloud. What does that really mean in today's organizations, and what for business, but then what does it also mean for security?
Yeah, absolutely. So before I answer that, I'm going to just really quick on the previous question. I get a sense a lot of what we're talking about here when we say inventory, there's physical machines, there's network pieces, there's general applications, and I'm always harping about the API. I'm an evangelist for API security, and that's one of the areas where we see there's some struggles with folks that we've talked to because it's an intangible. They can come from anywhere. Shadow APIs are out there. And what you said exactly about needing to have it constantly updated, because if it's updated manually, not automated, then it gets out of date before you get to it. And we see that same thing absolutely in spades at the API level. Along those lines, with the low code, no code, right? So low code, no code solutions are enabling citizen developers, right? The casual, untrained folks who want to get something done, right? And it's doing that by putting easier interfaces around API calls, really, if you think about what's happening, to abstract the complexities. And what that does is it makes it easier to get more and more system-to-system API connections out there and create more and more content that's using these connections. And with that, more API vulnerabilities or potential vulnerabilities are getting introduced. And so the low code, no code integrations themselves can have security vulnerabilities in them. The APIs oftentimes themselves that are getting used in the low code, no code creations also can have vulnerabilities, and so those are getting out there more. The citizen developers are less likely to be aware of good security hygiene, right? And their potential security risks. So I mean, let's face it, we're in DevSecOps today still trying to get professional developers to have a good security mindset. So someone who's just trying to sling something together quickly and get something done is less likely to have that security knowledge. And so what this means, I think, is that the onus is on the low code, no code providers, and of course still the API providers, actually especially them, to have and enforce good security hygiene at every level, and in their APIs as well. We see lots of authentication and authorization, especially authorization problems with APIs. It's like the #1 vulnerability out there, and that's rooted in the API not being written, as securely as it could be. And so generally, what this means is that it's even more important to have application security solutions in widespread use that understand security at the API level. And we're getting there, but we're not all the way there yet. So.
Anyone else want to chime in?
I think the comment about authorization is like 100%, maybe 110% correct. I think back about 20 years ago when companies first started to deploy search inside their firewall, right, in a corporate environment, and it was like, oh my gosh, everybody can read all the HR documents. We never knew that before. Oh, you can all see how much everybody's getting paid. Okay, so like pull the search out, go back and figure out how to ACL things. Now redeploy search, do that a few times. Low code, no code is the same thing, right? You're going to deploy it in your environment. People are going to run it, and then you're going to realize that they had access to read APIs that you didn't know that they had access to. They have access to write APIs that they definitely shouldn't have had access to. And that's not to say that it's a bad thing. In some sense, I think it just exposes the existing limitations on ACLs that we've deployed and on the controls that we have there. I'm optimistic on the actual security of the APIs. I'm pessimistic on what our existing internal infrastructure is for identity and authorization. And I think, but that's a relatively easy fix. Like the systems are there, we're just not sort of paying attention to them because we haven't really had visibility into how they could be abused very effectively in the past.
Right. Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, it's not that on-prem is secure and cloud isn't secure, and somehow we have to do all this extra lifting. It's more that a lot of companies didn't do a great job on-prem, so they actually have an opportunity to increase the security as they go to the cloud. Prakash or Kirsten, anything you wanted to add to that before we move to the next question?
I think Dan and Adrian pointed it out nicely. In my view, I think the impersonalization aspect of it, especially in the data centers or in cloud, the east-west traffic movement that you hardly notice what is happening, to Adrian's point. There's vulnerabilities, hidden vulnerabilities that you don't know until you go through that workflow, the path. So that's where the full stack observability is so important. And at the solution level, there needs to be a high level of validation. So all the good concepts that we have on the traditional server side should also coming into the network and security side as well. All the DevOps, so we call this DevSecOps. All the good practices have to come in. So I do believe that serviceability, in addition to it, anytime you see a movement that you did not expect, we should be able to intercept and bring the right level of interventions. So serviceability is also key.
So Kirsten, I'm going to start with you on this question, but I'd love to hear from all the panelists if you don't mind. With a buzzword alert to everybody who's watching, but what about SASE, the Secure Access Service Edge, and Zero Trust or ZTA architecture? Kirsten, what are they? And is this, there's a lot of noise about this. Is this the silver bullet for cloud security?
Well, I don't believe there is such a thing as a silver bullet for security, whether it's in the cloud or on premises. I'm going to start with Zero Trust. I'd agree that that is a buzzword. It gets used in many different ways. However, the intent really is useful and ties back to some of the conversation we've already been having, right? And there are a variety of elements available. So if we think about, what was just said about low code and no code, and sometimes the tools that our citizen developers are using, they introduce security issues that need to be assessed. We'll talk about maybe some other things, another buzzword, shift left, in a little bit, not at the moment, and how that might help. But in addition, right, the Zero Trust is partly designed to, the thinking around it is to design ways of deploying your solutions so that it's okay if there are some issues, they're still protected, right? Let's make sure that encryption of east-west traffic is always in place. It doesn't matter whether the developer has done that for themselves in building the application. The infrastructure enables it and supports it so that east-west traffic is always encrypted. Let's look at confidential computing. The concept of an enclave, encrypted containers and running encrypted containers, attestation of the infrastructure so that you know that it can't be changed unintentionally, right? You can use, you can identify that infrastructure is still in the state it was when you first deployed it. And ideally, attestation of workloads as well, right? So you kind of you look at all the layers and you build in that assumption that there will be a breach, there will be a vulnerability. How can I protect against that at all of the layers? Infrastructure, networking, the host operating system, the and the application layer itself. And as was mentioned, right, APIs are going to be key in this space. So also let's think about things like API gateways. But again, just building with the assumption that there will be a breach and that there will be folks who just aren't aware of vulnerabilities that might be present. So how can we create isolation around these items while still enabling them to communicate with each other? And I'm going to defer on SASE.
Okay, who wants to talk SASE?
Yeah, I can add a bit here there, what Kirsten called out, very nicely articulated, Kirsten. In my view, work is no longer a location. It's about activity that is performed, right? And SaaS, the transformation we talked about earlier, whether it's PaaS, infrastructure as a service, SaaS, and the allure is flexibility, elasticity, and all of the stuff. In addition to it, there is the ease of use. And clearly, performance and availability are the primary design consideration more than the security. SaaS is an attempt to solve some of these disparate single point solutions to a multifunction, fairly integrated network and security functionalities. We probably for watching this trend in terms of the SD-WAN shifts, all this secure web gateways, DNS services, firewall as a services, CASB, and Kirsten, you talked about zero trust network. SASE is a way to bring all of them together in a single pane of glass, right? That basically allows enterprise and networks and security administrator to do their job at scale. And Kirsten, to your point about consistently applying policies and ability to expand their operations, right? SASE brings that ability, in my view.
So Adrian, as a CISO, are you implementing zero trust architecture in SASE? What are your thoughts?
As defined by the panelists, absolutely. As defined by vendors, maybe. When I think about zero trust, I think that what it ultimately comes down to is acknowledging that you don't want any single failure in your system to lead to a catastrophic failure. Once upon a time, for those of us my age or older, there was a world where you could have a buffer overflow in a SQL server, and it would take down the whole internet. And it would take a couple days for the internet to come back. And so that was a world where there wasn't zero trust by any stretch of the imagination. And there were, layers upon layers of assumed trust. And so the motivation that we have is to get to the point where, a compromise of a single application shouldn't lead to a compromise of an entire device, shouldn't lead to a compromise of an entire network, shouldn't lead to a compromise of all of the things in your entire universe of applications. So that's how we think about it. And segmenting each of those and then building controls to measure the current integrity of those before you interact with them in a way that assumes trust is the sort of heart and soul of zero trust. The network was the first place that people thought of, but it was already being done in other places in the stack that they weren't necessarily as aware of. The more modern operating systems, Android, iOS, Chrome OS, and to some extent Windows and Mac OS at this point, also incorporate the idea of zero trust in terms of what the interactions are in the applications. And so I worked on Android, and that was like a core primitive was the compromise of a game shouldn't lead to the compromise of your device, which is a fairly transformational change. And one of the reasons that security is getting better is that you don't have to worry about that as much as you used to have to.
Yeah.
But once you've got that segmentation, you still need to have visibility. And so if we want to call that SASE, great. I think getting to a point where you have the ability to measure and see what's going on in your environment is sort of the core of what it is the security team is building. Which is funny, right? Because what they're really building is system integration. They're just like visibility, observability. These are things that aren't labeled security, and that security professionals perhaps don't think of themselves as, fundamentally focused on. But that's the hard part of the problem, is just understanding what's going on.
Yeah.
I think you have to add Linux to your list of operating
Oh,
systems.
I'm sorry, you're right.
With things like SE Linux. Sorry, couldn't resist.
Oh, well, I've
that in the
deployed
house.
more SE Linux than anybody else in the history of humanity, I think, when Android adopted it. So absolutely. Totally agree.
It's funny you mentioned observability, and we push an idea of security observability too, like the notion that we can see across all the pieces. It's what we're talking about, obviously bringing it all together, understanding across the layers is vitally important, especially as the parameters kind of disappear and morph around, right? I mean, we've talked to so many folks that said, oh wait, that API was an internal API. What do you mean someone's accessing it from the outside, right? Oh boy, I wish we had those multiple layers in place then, right? So
yeah. So this has been a great discussion. We actually need to start the wrap up, but I'd like to end with a lightning round question for the audience, which is, what's the one thing that you hope everybody who's listening to this panel does in the next week to strengthen their organizational cloud security posture? And Prakash, let's start with you. One thing you wish everybody would do.
At Cisco, we are taking a radical approach, and I want everyone to seriously consider that. We talk about shift left. Clearly, we are on our way of killing the bug mountain, including vulnerability creeps early in the code phase. Essentially, we are digitizing the software development, by which we are making subject matter experts an exemplary coder, right? So that's exactly what we are trying to do, and we want every other app developers to do that as well.
Thanks. Dan, what would you say?
Yeah, so I would say, again, along my theme of APIs, right? If you're not familiar with the risk that your APIs could be exposing you to, whoever's out there watching, then please go learn about API security and where the risk levels are. There's a lot of material out there. We've got a great ebook on our site. But if you are familiar and you think your WAF and your API gateway has you covered, I heard API gateway mentioned earlier. Read up on the OWASP API top 10 vulnerabilities and make sure that you are covered.
Yeah, great resource. Kirsten, what would you add?
Take a look at your culture and figure out a way to start incenting and enabling your app dev, security, and operations teams to collaborate on how to address security throughout the life cycle and throughout the stack in new ways, right? And it does require an incentive. And you might start small with a small team and give them a chance to experiment and try it out and iterate. But we have to break down those silos to really become effective in this new world.
Yeah, very true. Okay, Adrian, take us home. What's your one thing?
I like Kirsten's suggestion, so I'm just going to steal it.
Okay,
I think if you're a security professional, go talk to, and you're far enough up the food chain that your boss is not a security professional. Point out to them that there's a conflict of interest if they expect you to both be an advocate for security and an advisor on security. And emphasize to them that they need to start being the advocate because you want to be an advisor. And if that's already happening, great. I have a different recommendation for you. But if that's not happening, that's a critical relationship, is the point where your CEO or your CTO or wherever you report into, they should be the one that's saying security is fundamental, security is critical, you need to be focused on security. And then that gives the security team the flexibility to be like, oh, here's what that means, without feeling like they need to both fight for resourcing and then guide that resourcing. So make sure that relationship and that sort of order of operations is set correctly.
Put it in the DNA. Great advice. Thank you so much, Kirsten, Dan, Prakash, and Adrian, for being with us. And thank you, everybody, for listening to this session on the cloud and security.
Thanks, Diana. Thanks all.
Dan.
So I'd like to thank you all for participating in this panel. Diana, Kristen, Prakash, Dan, and Adrian, some really great